Postmodern literature is literature characterized by reliance on narrative techniques such as fragmentation, paradox, and the unreliable narrator, and often is defined as a style or a trend which emerged in the post-World War II era. Postmodern works are seen as a response against dogmatic following of Enlightenment thinking and modernist approaches to literature. Postmodern literature, like postmodernism as a whole, tends to resist definition or classification as a movement. Indeed, the convergence of postmodern literature with various modes of critical theory, particularly reader response and deconstructionist approaches, and the subversions of the implicit contract between author, text and reader by which its works are often characterized, have led to pre-modern fiction such as Cervantes' Don Quixote and Laurence Sterne's 18th-century satire Tristram Shandy being retrospectively considered by some as early examples of postmodern literature. While there is little consensus on the precise characteristics, scope, and importance of postmodern literature, as is often the case with artistic movements, postmodern literature is commonly defined in relation to a precursor. For example, a postmodern literary work tends not to conclude with a neatly tied-up ending as is often found in modernist literature, but often parodies it. Postmodern authors tend to celebrate chance over craft, and further employ metafiction to undermine the writer's authority. Another characteristic of postmodern literature is the questioning of distinctions between high and low culture through the use of pastiche, the combination of subjects and genres not previously deemed fit for literature. Background. Notable influences: playwrights who worked in the late 19th and early 20th century, whose thought and work would serve as an influence on the aesthetic of postmodernism include Swedish dramatist August Strindberg, the Italian author Luigi Pirandello, and the German playwright and theorist Bertolt Brecht. In the 1910s, artists associated with Dadaism celebrated chance, parody, playfulness, and challenged the authority of the artist. Tristan Tzara claimed in How to Make a Dadaist Poem that to create a Dadaist poem one had only to put random words in a hat and pull them out one by one. Another way Dadaism influenced postmodern literature was in the development of collage, specifically collage as using elements from advertisement or illustrations from popular novels. Artists associated with Surrealism, which developed from Dadaism, continued experimentations with chance and parody while celebrating the flow of the subconscious mind. André Breton, the founder of Surrealism, suggested that automatism and the description of dreams should play a greater role in the creation of literature. He used automatism to create his novel Nadja and used photographs to replace description as a parody of the overly descriptive novelists he often criticized. Surrealist René Magritte's experiments with signification are used as examples by Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Foucault also uses examples from George Louis Borges, an important direct influence on many postmodernist fiction writers. He is occasionally listed as a postmodernist, although he started writing in the 1920s. The influence of his experiments with metafiction and magic realism was not fully realized in the Anglo-American world until the postmodern period. Ultimately, this is seen as the highest stratification of criticism among scholars. Other early 20th century novels such as Raymond Roussel's Impressions d'Afrique and Locus Solis, and Giorgio de Chirico's Hebdomeros have also been identified as important postmodern precursors. Comparisons with modernist literature. Both modern and postmodern literature represent a break from 19th-century realism. In character development, both modern and postmodern literature explore subjectivism, turning from external reality to examine inner states of consciousness. In many cases drawing on modernist examples in their stream of consciousness styles of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. or explorative poems like The Waste Land by T.S. Eliot. In addition, both modern and postmodern literature explore fragmentariness in narrative and character construction. The Waste Land is often cited as a means of distinguishing modern and postmodern literature. The poem is fragmentary and employs pastiche like much postmodern literature, but the speaker in The Waste Land says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." Modernist literature sees fragmentation and extreme subjectivity as an existential crisis, or Freudian internal conflict, a problem that must be solved, and the artist is often cited as the one to solve it. Postmodernists, however, often demonstrate that this chaos is insurmountable, the artist is impotent, and the only recourse against ruin is to play within the chaos. Playfulness is present in many modernist works, and they may seem very similar to postmodern works. But with postmodernism, playfulness becomes central and the actual achievement of order and meaning becomes unlikely. Gertrude Stein's playful experiment with metafiction and genre in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas has been interpreted as postmodern. Shift to postmodernism. As with all stylistic eras, no definite dates exist for the rise and fall of postmodernism's popularity. 1941, the year in which Irish novelist James Joyce and English novelist Virginia Woolf both died, is sometimes used as a rough boundary for postmodernism's start. Irish novelist Flann O'Brien completed The Third Policeman in 1939. It was rejected for publication and remained supposedly lost until published posthumously in 1967. A revised version called The Dalkey Archive was published before the original in 1964, 2 years before O'Brien died. Notwithstanding its dilatory appearance, the literary theorist Keith Hopper regards The Third Policeman as one of the first of that genre they call the postmodern novel. The prefix «post», however, does not necessarily imply a new era. Rather, it could also indicate a reaction against modernism in the wake of the Second World War. It could also imply a reaction to significant post-war events. The beginning of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, post-colonialism, and the rise of the personal computer. Some further argue that the beginning of postmodern literature could be marked by significant publications or literary events. For example, some mark the beginning of postmodernism with the first publication of John Hawke's The Cannibal in 1949. The first performance of En Attendant Godot in 1953, the first publication of Howl in 1956 or of Naked Lunch in 1959. For others, the beginning is marked by moments in critical theory. Jacques Derrida's Structure, Sign, and Play lecture in 1966, or as late as Ihab Hassan's usage in The Dismemberment of Orpheus in 1971. Brian McHale details his main thesis on this shift. Although many postmodern works have developed out of modernism, modernism is characterized by an epistemological dominant, while postmodernism works are primarily concerned with questions of ontology, post-war developments and transition figures. Though postmodernist literature does not include everything written in the postmodern period, several post-war developments in literature have significant similarities. These developments are occasionally collectively labeled postmodern. More commonly, some key figures are cited as significant contributors to the postmodern aesthetic. The work of Jarry, the Surrealists, Antonin Artaud, Luigi Pirandello and so on also influenced the work of playwrights from the theatre of the absurd. The term theatre of the absurd was coined by Martin Esslin to describe a tendency in theatre in the 1950s. He related it to Albert Camus's concept of the absurd. The plays of the theatre of the absurd parallel postmodern fiction in many ways. For example, The Bald Soprano by Eugene Ionesco is essentially a series of clichés taken from a language textbook. One of the most important figures to be categorized as both absurdist and postmodern is Samuel Beckett. The work of Samuel Beckett is often seen as marking the shift from modernism to postmodernism in literature. He had close ties with modernism because of his friendship with James Joyce. However, his work helped shape the development of literature away from modernism. Joyce, one of the exemplars of modernism, celebrated the possibility of language. Beckett had a revelation in 1945 that, in order to escape the shadow of Joyce, he must focus on the poverty of language and man as a failure. His later work, likewise, featured characters stuck in inescapable situations attempting impotently to communicate, whose only recourse is to play, to make the best of what they have. As Hans-Peter Wagner says, mostly concerned with what he saw as impossibilities in fiction, Beckett's experiments with narrative form and with the disintegration of narration and character in fiction and drama won him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. His works published after 1969 are mostly meta-literary attempts that must be read in light of his own theories and previous works and the attempt to deconstruct literary forms and genres. Beckett's last text, published during his lifetime, Stirring Still, breaks down the barriers between drama fiction and poetry, with texts of the collection being almost entirely composed of echoes and reiterations of his previous work. He was definitely one of the fathers of the postmodern movement in fiction, which has continued undermining the ideas of logical coherence in narration, formal plot, regular time sequence, and psychologically explained characters. The Beat Generation was the youth of America during the materialistic 1950s. Jack Kerouac, who coined the term, developed ideas of automatism into what he called spontaneous prose to create a maximalistic, multi-novel epic called the Deluoz Legend in the mold of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. More broadly, Beat Generation often includes several groups of post-war American writers, from the Black Mountain Poets, the New York School, the San Francisco Renaissance, and so on. These writers have occasionally also been referred to as the postmoderns, though this is now a less common usage of postmodern. References to these writers as postmodernists still appear, and many writers associated with this group appear often on lists of postmodern writers. One writer associated with the Beat Generation who appears most often on lists of postmodern writers is William S. Burroughs. Burroughs published Naked Lunch in Paris in 1959 and In America in 1961. This is considered by some the first truly postmodern novel because it is fragmentary. With no central narrative arc, it employs pastiche to fold in elements from popular genres such as detective fiction and science fiction. It's full of parody, paradox, and playfulness, and, according to some accounts, friends Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg edited the book guided by chance. He is also noted, along with Brian Gysin, for the creation of the cut-up technique, a technique in which words and phrases are cut from a newspaper or other publication and rearranged to form a new message. This is the technique he used to create novels such as Nova Express and The Ticket That Exploded. Magic realism is a technique popular among Latin American writers in which supernatural elements are treated as mundane. Though the technique has its roots in traditional storytelling, it was a centerpiece of the Latin American boom, a movement coterminous with postmodernism. Some of the major figures of the boom, and practitioners of magic realism, are sometimes listed as postmodernists. This labeling, however, is not without its problems. In Spanish-speaking Latin America, modernismo and postmodernismo refer to early 20th century literary movements that have no direct relationship to modernism and postmodernism in English, finding it anachronistic. Octavio Paz has argued that postmodernism is an imported grand acute CIT that is incompatible with the cultural production of Latin America. Along with Beckett and Borges, a commonly cited transitional figure is Vladimir Nabokov. Like Beckett and Borges, Nabokov started publishing before the beginning of postmodernity. Though his most famous novel, Lolita, could be considered a modernist or a postmodernist novel, his later work are more clearly postmodern. See Brian McHale. SCO. Postmodernism in literature is not an organized movement with leaders or central figures, therefore, it is more difficult to say if it has ended or when it will end. Arguably postmodernism peaked in the 1960s and 1970s with the publication of Catch-22 in 1961, Lost in the Funhouse in 1968, Slaughterhouse-5 in 1969, and many others. Thomas Pynchon's 1973 novel Gravity's Rainbow is often considered as the postmodern novel, redefining both postmodernism and the novel in general. Some declared the death of postmodernism in the 1980s with a new surge of realism, represented and inspired by Raymond Carver. Tom Wolfe, in his 1989 article, Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast, called for a new emphasis on realism in fiction to replace postmodernism. With this new emphasis on realism in mind, some declared White Noise in 1985 or The Satanic Verses in 1988 to be the last great novels of the postmodern era. A new generation of writers, such as David Foster Wallace, Janine Abrashi, Dave Eggers, Michael Chabon, Zadie Smith, Chuck Palahniuk, Jennifer Egan, Neil Gaiman, Richard Powers, Jonathan Lethem, Denver Fernandez, and publications such as McSweeney's The Believer, Denver Fernandez's Rebirths, and the fiction pages of The New Yorker, herald either a new chapter of postmodernism or possibly post-postmodernism.